Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Sam Koslowski.
I'm Emma Gillespie.
On Friday morning, New South Wales MP Gareth Ward resigned from State Parliament just moments before he was due to be expelled by his fellow MPs. Ward was found guilty of sexual assault offences last month and is currently in jail awaiting sentencing. On today's podcast, we're going to break down what happened here, why it took so long to get to this point, and what happens next.
Sam, we are talking today about jailed, now former MP Gareth Ward, a New South Wales politician. This has been quite the political drama. It's stretched over months and years, and we finally have a resolution. But let's start with who Gareth Ward is, especially for listeners outside of New South Wales, and how we got to this situation.
So Gareth Ward was first elected to New South Wales Parliament back in 2011. He was representing the seat of Kiama on the New South Wales South Coast. He was a minister in the previous coalition government, but left the party 4 years ago when historic sexual abuse allegations against him first surfaced.
Okay, so elected as a Liberal MP to the New South Wales Parliament, and then later ran as an independent and was re-elected.
Yeah, and despite these allegations against him, Ward was re-elected as an independent for Kiama in 2023. Now, fast forward to this year, and on the 25th of July, after a 9-week trial in the Downing Centre District Court in Sydney, he was found guilty of 3 counts of indecent assault and 1 count of sexual intercourse without consent against 2 men who were aged 18 and 24 at the time of the offences.
So Gareth Ward has been convicted. He is in prison as we speak. And I think there are a lot of people who would assume that those convictions automatically disqualified him from the Parliament, that would sort of mean the end of his political career. And I think this really speaks to why this case has sparked such national interest, because that's not actually how it works, is it?
No, and it's an interesting quirk in how our parliamentary system works. MPs aren't automatically dismissed if criminal charges are laid against them, or even if they're convicted. So Parliament can pass what's called a motion to expel a member, but only if their behaviour would bring the House into disrepute. And this kind of expulsion is super rare, so it hasn't been done since 1969. And up until Friday, both Labor and the Coalition were urging Ward to resign on his own terms, rather than force Parliament to take what they consider an extraordinary step.
Yeah, and it is such a rare step. We should clarify that this kind of expulsion is so rare in New South Wales. It hasn't happened for 107 years. So there have been other expulsions at other levels of government, but incredibly rare set of circumstances for the state. But as you mentioned, Ward didn't resign voluntarily despite that pressure from MPs for him to step aside rather than be forced out. What was his strategy? Why didn't he resign after he was convicted?
It took a little bit of time, didn't it, for him to actually come around to that decision. So Ward is currently in custody. He instructed his lawyers to apply to the New South Wales Supreme Court to delay the vote in New South Wales Parliament on his expulsion. And there were kind of 2 key arguments that he wanted his legal team to mount. And so the first one was that Parliament couldn't remove him while he was still awaiting his sentencing and while he was planning to appeal his conviction. And the second argument was that Ward wouldn't have the opportunity to respond to the motion in Parliament because clearly he's in jail. And I guess from that respect, it's a fair point procedurally. He's literally in a jail cell and can't actually physically appear at the Parliament to give a speech in his own defence.
But also he's in jail because he has been found guilty of sex offences. But it is a fascinating legal argument to unpack. How did the courts respond?
So initially, the court granted a temporary order to prevent New South Wales Parliament from having this expulsion vote from going ahead. The government said it had chosen to respect the will of the court, even though there's this really interesting battle between the Supreme Court and the way that the Parliament is run. It's kind of that church versus state idea coming into it. But the government then appealed that decision in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court allowed for an urgent hearing on Thursday afternoon and then ultimately rejected Ward's lawyers' arguments and ruled that the expulsion vote could go ahead, and that was set for around 10 o'clock on Friday morning.
Okay, so we have this vote scheduled to happen in the lower house of New South Wales Parliament to expel Gareth Ward, but that didn't end up going ahead? Because after all of these calls for his resignation, after months of that push, he finally did just that.
Hello, Billy here from TDA. We have just looked at our YouTube analytics and 95% of you who are watching our videos aren't subscribing. If you want to help independent media like us grow, the best way you can do that is by pressing subscribe. Thank you so much, and back to the video.
Yeah, so the vote was unnecessary because he sent a letter to the lower house speaker, a man called Greg Piper, and Gareth Ward confirmed he had submitted a resignation. It was effective immediately. So essentially, it was kind of almost half an hour or maybe even generously an hour before this vote that Ward voluntarily resigned and his fellow MPs were no longer needed to gather in the chamber to vote to kick him out.
And we know that the vote would have ultimately ended in his expulsion because we'd heard from the Labor government and the Liberal opposition all in favour of removing him from the House.
Exactly. It was really a done deal.
So what was the reaction from Parliament then? They'd been gearing up for this vote and at the 11th hour, essentially, Ward chooses to step down.
Yep.
What did Parliament say?
Well, New South Wales lower house leader Ron Honig said this after Ward's resignation.
Not in 107 years has this House been required to expel a member. And the fact that we were about to make such a determination is a pretty shameful exercise and should have been done following the verdict by the jury.
On the other side of the aisle, Liberal leader Mark Speakman has said the opposition was ready to have Gareth Ward expelled from Parliament after Thursday's court ruling. So, as you said, it was a done deal and then it kind of took another path to the same result just before the vote.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting hearing from Ron Honig, the lower house leader you mentioned, after all of this happened. And he spoke about the people of Kiama. So this is the electorate that Gareth Ward represented, saying that they, as an electorate, had put their faith in him, that they had re-elected him, presuming his innocence after he was charged, that he had said he was innocent and that they respected that, and that ultimately, you know, not only had he let down the Parliament by dragging the process out, but that he had also let down those voters too.
Yeah.
So, Sam, what will happen now? He's no longer the member for Kiama. So does that trigger a by-election?
Exactly. So the people of Kiama will have to go back to the polls and vote for their new representative in the New South Wales Parliament. No date has been set yet for that by-election. Ward will remain in custody. He's been remanded since that guilty verdict and has a sentencing hearing scheduled for the 19th of September. His legal team says he still does plan to appeal the conviction, but no formal appeal has been lodged yet.
Okay. Sam, before we wrap this up, I do want to zoom out a little bit and ask you about this whole idea of automatically suspending a parliamentarian, or that not being the case, you know, not just in New South Wales, but this is the process in other states and territories, and even in a federal context. If someone's charged with a serious offence, that doesn't automatically discount them.
Yeah.
And I think this has really been the centre of the conversation.
Totally. And it's such a tough question to answer because you kind of have two competing ideas here. You've got the idea of protecting our democratic institutions and making sure that there's people in those positions of power that are respected and have, physically freedom of movement and aren't in the jail cell.
Yep.
But also then you have this idea of due process. So the idea that somebody should be eligible to have a fair trial and they're innocent until proven guilty. And I guess in Gareth Ward's case, if he's planning an appeal, then this is an ongoing legal process. And so on one hand, MPs convicted of serious crimes clearly undermine public trust. Most people would say it's totally untenable to have someone representing them from a jail cell. And as we saw in Ward's case, courts are generally going to accept that parliaments can actually kick out members who damage the institution's reputation. But if you're talking about automatically suspending a parliamentarian just based on charges being laid, that's a much trickier situation. And that, legal experts say, could threaten the presumption of innocence.
Yeah, you do have to wonder, you know, for the people of an electorate, whether or not a person is accused of something and whether or not that means they're guilty. The time that it takes for them to either fight those charges or appear in court, go to lengthy hearings, you know, whether the distraction of what that could place on them or the burden of those proceedings, whether that's the right thing for an electorate to have their member be so preoccupied, I think is also a worthy question.
And that kind of leads into something I was thinking about a lot, which is that the people of Kiama and whatever electorate we talk about with a story like this, they're entitled to a representative in Parliament and they deserve a voice in Parliament, as we all do in part of a democracy. And if you have somebody who is facing charges, going through a jury system, whether they are found guilty or innocent at the end, you're right. They're not able to do their job for the people of their electorate in that time. And in some ways, the expulsion of Gareth Ward or the resignation just before the expulsion actually means that the people of Kiama can now actually get a voice back through this by-election process. It was much harder for the people of Kiama when there was a suspension because he technically was still the member, but he couldn't, in all honesty, do the job that he needed to do.
Really fascinating, Sam. Thank you so much for taking us through that one.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you so much for listening to today's deep dive. That's all from us for now, but we will be back this evening with your news headlines. And just a quick reminder, if this episode has raised any issues for you, help is available through 1-800-RESPECT. We'll pop some resources in the episode description.